Over 100 years ago, New England poet Robert Frost wrote The Road Not Taken, which has become a metaphor for the choices we make as we journey through our lives. Today, Native American writer and chronicler, my friend Trace DeMeyer Hentz, shares her story and that has made all the difference.
My guest today is a very interesting friend of mine, and I'm trying to find a way to describe her, but I guess I have to use her own words for this. A curious but traumatized child adoptee, as a young actor and rock musician traveling the States, as a wife and grandmother, and a working writer, publisher, blogger. You go on to say, I used to be a rock singer, shop owner, trophy wife, Native history book junkie, journalist, radio show producer. That's changed like titles change, names change. Well, who the heck are you?
Oh boy, you had to start with all the big ones, right? No, I'm teasing. I'm a journalist and I'm a historian. My name is Trace Hentz and used to be DeMeyer. I published under the name DeMeyer, but in 2014, I changed my name to Hentz. So I've been republishing some of my books with that name. My husband loves that because he likes me using the name. And so, yes, I was a blogger since my memoir came out in 2009. So I started, well, actually, I had to do the book first. And then they say, if you have a book, you have to have a blog. And so I started blogging on American Indian adoptees. And then I also started my own writer's blog where I actually write about news. So, yeah, I have had a lot of titles, but things change. And so since I've been married to Herb, I've had way more freedom. I haven't had to work for a newspaper, though I have worked for newspapers. And that's where I am right now.
You've been a phenomenal historian, and writing in particular about topics that don't really get the limelight in terms of the published media. And, you know, there's a heavy dose of self-introspection that goes into your writing. There's a lot of history in your writing. There's a lot of passion in your writing. What drives you?
What drives me, I believe, is the need to tell more of the history that we weren't taught in school. I learned a lot of Native history at a kitchen table in South Dakota on the Oglala Lakota Reservation. And what I realized is we need to know more. We need to know more about the founding of the country, the conquest, and a lot of the incidents that happened that affect us even to this day. So I am very passionate about history, and I do think it needs to be incorporated into journalism better than it has been. I think Native people represent a pretty significant part of our country, though they are isolated on reservations, not all. There's about 80% of Native people that actually live in cities because they need to work. So we've been rather invisible, but we're becoming more visible now. So I'm very happy about that. But that does drive me. I became a journalist in 1996, and I worked for a national Native newspaper. There were only 2 in the country. And I felt it was really important to do the very best job that I could do. And I won awards for it, so I think I did okay.
You must be doing the right thing.
I think so, apparently.
At what point in your life did this become the passion, the driving force?
Right. Now, this is sort of unexpected, but I was about 10 when I used to journal about things that were happening, like my grandmother, or if I lost my dog, if he died or something. So, but I told myself I wouldn't become a journalist until I had a lived experience. So I really didn't start till I was about 40 years old, which is probably old for some people because some journalists go in when they're in their 20s. But I did not do that. But I do have to tell you, Elliott, one of the things I did in 1995 was I read a book called The Artist's Way. It's by Julia Cameron. And in that book, she tells you to write 3 pages every day, no matter what day of the week it is. And what you do is you start numbering your pages, like day one, whatever the year is. And I did that for 2 years, and I became a journalist really 2 years later. So I was already a writer, but there was something about the practice of writing that actually changed in me, and my confidence also changed. I felt I could be a journalist. And it was funny because one of the first jobs I got was as an editor of a weekly Wisconsin newspaper. I was like, I'm going right into editor. I think I should be a journalist first, or reporter. But actually the editor job actually did a lot of reporting. And I have to this, I'll tell you real quick. I wrote one of my very first feature articles was about a woman who lost her son to the AIDS epidemic. And what she had done, she created an AIDS quilt piece, and she was going to put it with this touring AIDS quilt. So I went and wrote an article. I took a picture of her with a picture of her son who had died and a picture of the AIDS quilt piece. And there was a minister in Wisconsin that called me a lethal journalist for writing that story. And I thought my publisher would be like, you need to, tone it down. He didn't say that at all. I thought, you know what? I've graduated. That's it. Now I know I'm doing a good job. If you make people think and they're that angry that they need to write a letter to the editor. So I think that kind of kicked me off in a very good way. That wasn't a failure. It was a wake-up call. I thought, okay, I could offend people with writing something as beautiful as a story about a mother who lost her son. So,
your first book,
yes,
was about 20 years ago. Am I right?
Yes, you're exactly right. I was in Wisconsin when I was asked to write a chapter about Jim Thorpe. Now, a lot of people know that he's one of the world's greatest athletes. I was still at News from Indian Country in Wisconsin when they asked me to write it. And Indian Country was calling me the expert in Jim Thorpe because I knew his family. His daughter would call the office and speak to me, Jim Thorpe's daughter, Grace. And I met his 2 sons, and it was remarkable how they looked like their dad, not Grace so much as the 2 boys. And they told me a story about when he would play catch with the kids, he didn't treat them like kids. He treated them like grown men. Like if he threw a baseball, it was just as fast. He would throw to the game, and they were like, oh, we learned real quick to dodge, like we knew to get out of the way. This man, he could do anything. And what had happened in 1997, I do remember the year, they had 2 of his sons had come to Wisconsin to retrieve the medals that he had qualified to be in the Olympics. And for some reason, those medals had never been returned to the family. So it took about 70 years for them to get the Olympic medals back, and then for them to get the qualifying medals back. So they kept me in touch with them. They mailed me things, they phoned me, and they said, we're doing this, could you write it up? And I'd write it up. So the one thing, though, that I feel really bad about is Grace Thorpe asked me before she passed if I would try and get the chalice that had been given to him by the Tsar of Russia, a 30-pound silver chalice that was a gift to him, which never should have been taken away from him since it was a gift. And she said, I need you to go to Switzerland for me and get that chalice for our family. And I haven't been able to do that. So
So
isn't that, it's just remarkable. Okay, so I meant to say, I was asked to do the chapter. I wrote about 30 pages, Elliott. I mean, I really went all out into every detail about Jim. And they used maybe about 8 pages of 29, 30 pages that I had done, but that's pretty normal. So Rutgers Press published that. The 2 women that they're the editors, they had asked, me, they had found me and said, you're really good in writing on him. So that came out in the year 2000. So that's 20 years. That was my very first book. It was a very big deal to me. I was really honored. They were honored. The Thorpe family was very happy. And then I went to the Pequot Times in Connecticut, where I was really too busy to write a book. I was publishing every month 3 different papers for them, and an annual report, which we had to do. That was one of the papers that had to be done annually. Mm-hmm. So that was about 5 years of work. But once I got here and married in 2004, all hell broke loose. I started writing books like, oh my gosh, I couldn't stop. And I'm still doing it. And now I'm also publishing other people.
That's fantastic. Your memoir, One
Yes.
Small Sacrifice.
Yes.
What led you to that, to putting that to paper?
Well, I had drafted a book on adoption, believe it or not. I started to, first of all, I did a story called Generation After Generation, We Are Coming Home. And it was for a magazine in New York called Talking Stick. So Talking Stick asked me to write an article about all these adoptees and where are they and what are they doing now? And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know. And it took me over a year, Elliott. I mean, I'm a journalist. You're supposed to turn things out in a couple of days. And I kept sending drafts to the editor in New York and in New York City. And I said, I'm having so much trouble writing this story. I've got to find other adoptees. I mean, I know what my story is, but the internet was becoming a thing and more was showing up in newspapers and online. So that article really started it out. Because once I did that article, I realized, oh my gosh, people don't know this history at all. They don't know what happened, that after the residential boarding schools in the United States, most people know about that Indian children were taken off the reservation and taken to schools. There were, I think, 360, maybe, some number like that. Well, they also started to do adoptions because they were trying to assimilate the Indian into American culture. And the more I looked at adoption, I was just astounded what I was finding. I had no idea, even growing up as an adoptee, that all this information existed. Well, I sent the book, a draft, to a literary agent in New York City. And you know what she told me? She said, you've got to start over. You've got to write about you. And here I'd done all this work on an adoption history. And I was like, so that was like 2004, 2005. It took 5 years for me to actually want to write anything about myself. I mean, that really wasn't my training. My training was to talk to other people, but I figured I had to do it. And that kind of meant reliving some of what I had gone through as a child. And a lot of the questions and how I actually opened my adoption. When I was 22, I went to a judge because it was illegal actually to find out who your parents were, but he actually let me read my file. And because of that, I actually had a chance to find my families, my mother's side and my father's side. So all that had to go into the memoir. But in 2018, I was asked to write a paper for the University of Minnesota about disappeared children. Now, these aren't adoptees as much as they are children who went missing in maybe the Carlisle boarding school. They were sent to families and they died, or they disappeared and they don't know what happened to them. So I did this paper about that, and I realized I have to redo my memoir because that's really important part of the story. We don't even know exactly how many children disappeared, but they were in white families' homes. They were on farms, but some died and some disappeared, and we don't know where they are. So anyway, I'm having to redo my memoir. I just took it off the market. I said, I'm going to retire the first book, and I'm going to have to redo it. And I've been working on it, but this pandemic sort of threw me for a loop a little bit. I thought I'd be more productive, but not so much. I think processing what's happening to the United States right now, it took a lot of us by surprise, a pandemic. So I did publish a book for a friend of mine named John Hopkins. He published Crockett's Gold a few months ago. And I also published a smaller book, a chapbook called Becoming. And it's got a lot of history, personal pieces, and poetry. So we've been getting things done, but not nearly at the rate that I'm used to.
Now, this whole process that you go through, it can be cathartic, it can be eye-opening, it can be depressing.
Mm-hmm.
What was the darkest moment for you?
Well, I had a neighbor that lived next door to me. She was probably in her 70s, and she read my memoir. And she stopped at the abuse part when I was a child. She pretty much landed at that part of the book and couldn't go any further. And because she knew me and we spent a lot of time together, I thought to myself, that was the hardest part to write, going back in time and remembering being, a 13, 14-year-old and having gone through that with my adoptive father. I knew that would affect people, but I didn't actually know how much of an effect it would have. So she was my example of people that stalled out. And then what happened with that, Elliott, is people started telling me that they had been molested or sexually abused themselves. So here's a memoir about being an adoptee, and it also turns into something a little bit more than that. Yeah. And I'm happy. I'm totally fine with it. But I did not really see that coming. It was very hard to write. I did not want to expose myself to the general public that I had gone through that. But I also had therapy a couple of times, and I've processed all of it. And it's not affecting me now, but it's taken years, and it is something that's very hard to write about. I don't recommend it unless you actually have a very strong support system.
So let's go the other direction.
Yeah.
The brightest moment.
The brightest moment is actually meeting my dad. I was 38 years old, and I flew to St. Louis, Missouri, and I had to get picked up, and I met 5 siblings and my dad. That was huge. That, I think, changed my world. And now I've actually met other people. I've met extended family. So I feel like I'm part of a family tree that I didn't even know existed growing up. And that's remarkable. It's very good. It's very, very good.
In doing my research, I came across something rather, I don't know if it's bizarre or what, but the line was psycho playboys.
Oh, aren't you perceptive? You're reading my blog, I guess. Yeah, I decided, I think on my Amazon page, maybe my author's page, I wrote a really kind of a very unusual book called Mental Midgets, Musquinichi. And it's a creative nonfiction. It's got quotes, it's got poetry, it's got photographs. And I thought, after this book, I'm definitely going to write about psychos. So, yeah, psycho playboys. Trump being, one of my definite
We're coming kind of to the end of our half hour, but I had to ask you something, knowing that, know you personally and knowing that you tend to take an activist role in life. What's the significance of Deb Holland and Sharice Davids to the Native American?
Well, to Native Americans being in government, it's not a total non-occurrence. It has happened in the past. Ben Nighthorse Campbell signed a picture that's behind me. He's wearing a headdress. I don't know if you can see it. There have been Native Americans in government, but not nearly enough. And the Department of the Interior runs Indian Country Bureau of Indian Affairs. And a lot of the poverty and the scarcity could actually be addressed with the right person in that position. They've given it a lot of talk service over the years. With Deb being in that role, and Kevin Gover was in charge of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he is a Pawnee, so he is a Native man. It could be significant in the education part of it, because we've got a lot of protected lands right now that are in danger of mining, kind of what Trump has opened up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. That would be devastating. There are tribes that live there. And if they allow mining and oil extraction, it would be devastating to the planet. So hopefully Deb will be able to take a look at these things and slow some of this down, because I think oil is becoming a thing of the past. I think it's yesterday, it's not tomorrow. And I think she will, with a very balanced approach. She actually grew up in a pueblo where uranium mining had polluted the land she grew up on. And if you've lived in Navajo land or in any of the pueblo areas, you can't drink the water. I mean, it's really not even safe to be there. So I think that could change Indian countries' potential for getting some of their health issues addressed. Poverty does cause food scarcity, and a lot of the epidemics that happen on reservations are due to having a really insufficient diet. So I'm really hoping that with her in that position, things could really change. Finally, after 500 years. Yeah.
Some things take a little while. But,
that's exactly right. But you have to be patient.
One of the current projects you're working on is an update on One Small Sacrifice. And maybe you could share something about that with us, please.
Sure, Elliott. Thanks for even asking. The first edition of this came out in about 2010. It took about 5 years to write. And I'm actually going to read you just the very first chapter. It explains a lot. So it starts with, who are you? Stop and think about this. Who are you? Think about your parents, your grandparents, and great-grandparents who you knew when you were growing up. Remember the stories of when, where, even how you were born. Now imagine you disappear. You're erased, no longer a part of your family history and genealogy. How would you feel? Grateful? I don't think so. Now, imagine an adoptee who doesn't know who they are, nothing, absolutely nothing, anything zilch. Can you imagine looking in the mirror, not knowing anything? How might that feel? A fairy tale, you think? Adopted people are the only people in the world without free or unlimited access to their personal history. We simply vanish into thin air. This decision was made for us. Some decided this long ago. Someone decided adoptees were better off not knowing anything. Someone decided this for me. I'd be fine never knowing my identity. Wait, I was dead without my identity, without my name. I can't live like this. My adoptive family had their stories, their names, their parents, grandparents' names, where they were from, how they lived, died, everything. Like my adoptive mom and dad, many families are very proud of their stories. There could be bank robbers, horse thieves, rich barons, or fancy politicians. Mine could be too. To tell my story, I needed more than their story. I needed my own.
Wow. That's quite powerful.
That is the very first chapter.
At what point did this hit you that you needed your own?
I was 22. I waited, Elliott. I was about 16, I think, when I made the decision, but I was 22 when I said, I've got a college degree. I'm done with school. I'm probably going to leave Wisconsin. I went to a courthouse and I looked for a judge's name on the wall, and I went to his secretary and I asked to speak to him. I don't even know what really, it had to have been Great Spirit that gave me the idea to do that, because I was out of options. There was nothing I could do. It was all locked away. It was all sealed in a file. So that idea of knowing who I really am, I felt should be a right for every human being. And the judge actually agreed with me. I did give him a reason. I said, well, I don't have any medical history. And he agreed. He said, I really think that adoptees should be able to find out, who they are, who their families are. So he was able to do that for me, even though I could keep no copies of anything, Elliott. all I had to do was take notes, and I was so unprepared. He gave me like a little pad and a pencil, and I wrote 2 pages of the file that I was looking at. And it wasn't a thin file. It was like a lawyer file. It was very thick. And I was 22. I'd never looked at a legal document in my life. So I'm reading things, and it finally hit me. Oh my God, they're talking about me. And that pretty much just changed everything right then. So I had my name, I had my mother's name. And then it took me several years to find her. And like I told you earlier, I was 38 when I finally met my father, but I had to get his name through her because he wasn't on any of the documents. Wow. So that was really, really, really hard. I want to read you something, Elliott, because this really describes my experience as an adoptee. It's called Ghost Shell. It's very short. It's a poem. I dream of this, the weight, a tortoise shell on my back, a heavy hull. Did I choose its protection? I was asleep. No one ever said you can drop it now or it's safe to drop that, you'll be okay. Maybe the shell did protect me at one time when I needed armor. Maybe it isolated me for reasons that I do not know or understand. It was heavy and hard to balance. When I woke up, I could feel its weight. I can still feel it like a ghost, like an arm or leg amputated. Somehow it still signals my brain, protect yourself. Maybe my mother put the shell on me before she left me. Maybe I inherited it like a talisman. Maybe the shell was what women in my family wore to survive. All I know is I was born with it.
Wow.
Now that's an adoptee story. That's absolutely true. This is a true story. But I put it in prose because I thought, I actually, was a finalist in a Goodread poetry contest. I almost won. I came in second place, national poetry contest, and it was voted on by the general public. So, and I just read it at a friend of mine, an adoptee had passed away, and I read it at her funeral, and people asked for copies of it. So it kind of describes the things that you seem to be surrounded by this kind of a shell. And I really wanted to let that shell go. As an adoptee, once I had all my answers, that was possible, Elliott. That became possible.
Trace, it has been a definite pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
And, I've learned a lot about my friend.
Yes,
and
you have.
You've shared a lot about you with your readers and with the public. I thank you for that. Be well.
Thank you, Elliott. I really appreciate it.
Trace DeMeyer Hentz is a Native American writer, blogger, and chronicler residing in Greenfield, Massachusetts. Her published work can be purchased through community booksellers and online vendors. Visit her blog online at www.tracehentz.com.